Jackson Lancaster sat at the most exclusive table in the room, yet he felt like an outsider. Across from him, Haley Sterling tilted her champagne flute, the light catching on her perfectly manicured fingers. "You've been quiet tonight," she purred, offering a knowing smile. "What's wrong? Bored of your own empire?" Jackson's jaw tightened. Haley knew exactly why he was bored. This wasn't his world. Not really. It never had been, no matter how many millions sat in his bank account. He should have been entertained. The mayor sat at his table, discussing some development project that promised to elevate Savannah's cultural scene. The city's wealthiest philanthropists exchanged tales of their latest travels. Weekends in Paris, summers in Santorini, extravagant shopping sprees in Milan. And yet, Jackson barely heard a word, because none of it mattered. Not to him. He forced a smirk. "Just taking it all in," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Haley leaned in, her perfume sweet and intoxicating. "Come on, Jackson. It's been 6 months. Are you really going to keep pretending we don't belong together?" Her voice was smooth, practiced. "Look around. There isn't a single woman in this room who wouldn't kill to be with you." He did look around, at the sea of polished smiles, shallow conversations, and calculated interest. Every woman here had the same expression Haley did, one of expectation, as if Jackson was some trophy to be claimed. A slow, empty chuckle rumbled in his chest. "That's exactly the problem," he muttered under his breath, knocking back the last of his drink. Haley's expression flickered, just for a second. Then she recovered. "You're not serious," she scoffed. "You really think you're going to find someone different? You've built a name for yourself, Jackson. The man who turned a single restaurant into an empire. You don't get to pretend you're not part of this world." Maybe she was right, but that didn't mean he had to like it. He started to push back his chair, already planning his escape, when a loud crash split through the air. Gasp rippled through the ballroom as heads turned toward the commotion at the far end of the room. A woman stood frozen near the entrance, a silver tray clattering at her feet, red wine dripping from a shattered glass. And Haley Sterling's mother, the evening's esteemed hostess, was now drenched in deep crimson liquid, staring in horror at the stains spreading across her ivory gown. Silence. A cold, cutting silence. Then the whispers began. Jackson's gaze snapped to the waitress who was already scrambling to clean up the mess, her hands trembling as she grabbed napkins. Her chestnut brown hair was hastily tied back, a few loose strands falling into her face. The name embroidered on her uniform read Genesis. I'm so sorry, Mom," she stammered, kneeling to pick up the glass. "It was an accident. An accident." Mrs. Sterling's voice was like ice. "Do you have any idea what this dress costs?" Genesis paled. She probably doesn't," someone scoffed, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Doubt she could afford the buttons." Laughter. Cruel, biting laughter. Jackson felt something inside him snap. Before Genesis could open her mouth again, a waitstaff manager stormed toward her, his expression twisted with frustration. "That's enough, Carter. Go to the kitchen. Now." "But I said now." His tone left no room for argument. Genesis swallowed hard. Without another word, she ducked her head and rushed toward the back of the ballroom. Jackson was already on his feet. He didn't think. Didn't care about the eyes watching him. Didn't care about the murmurs of confusion as he strode past his table. "Jackson," Haley hissed, grabbing his wrist. "Where are you?" He pulled away. "You already know." Without waiting for a response, he pushed through the crowd and followed Genesis. He caught up just as she slipped into a side corridor, her head down, fingers gripping the front of her uniform. "Hey." She jolted at the sound of his voice, spinning around. "What?" Her brows furrowed in confusion. "Why are you—" Then her eyes widened. Recognition. You're Jackson Lancaster. He arched a brow. That depends. You planning to throw a drink on me too? A startled laugh escaped her lips, but her eyes were still wary. You shouldn't be back here. You shouldn't be apologizing, he countered. That wasn't your fault. Genesis shook her head. It doesn't matter. They don't care about mistakes, just status. That was a familiar feeling. Her shoulders slumped. This was a one-night catering gig. They'll probably fire me before I even get my check. You work somewhere else? Her jaw tensed like she didn't want to answer, but after a beat, she exhaled. Magnolia Cafe. He knew it. A small, no-frills diner in Savannah's historic district, known for its home-cooked meals and loyal customers. A place he used to go before he became Jackson Lancaster. Something about that made him pause. Carter, he murmured, glancing at her uniform again. Genesis Carter. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her gaze. That's me. He could tell she wanted him to leave it alone, but he wasn't going to. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. I need a new chef, he said casually. Genesis blinked. What? I need a chef, and something tells me you'd be better at it than half the people in my kitchen. She let out a disbelieving laugh. So you follow me out here and your first thought is to hire me? Why not? Jackson leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You're not like anyone else in that room. Genesis stared at him for a long moment. Then, with an almost amused expression, she exhaled. That's not a compliment, is it? It is, he said simply. Something flickered in her eyes again. Something hesitant, curious. Then, she shook her head. Thanks, but no thanks. I already have a job. Jackson smirked. That's what you're going with? She rolled her eyes. I don't work for rich men with control issues. He let out a slow chuckle. You have me all figured out already? Pretty much. Jackson should have walked away. Should have let her go. But he didn't. Instead, he pulled a sleek black card from his wallet and held it out. In case you change your mind. Genesis eyed the card, then him. Slowly she took it, turning it over between her fingers. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Jackson knew this wasn't the last time they'd see each other. The neon sign of Magnolia Cafe flickered against the humid Savannah night, casting a soft glow over the quiet street. Inside, the scent of fresh biscuits and coffee lingered, mingling with the low hum of conversation. The place was winding down for the evening, with only a handful of late-night regulars still seated in the vinyl booths. Genesis Carter stood behind the counter, refilling the sugar dispensers with mechanical precision. Her hands worked fast, but her mind was elsewhere. Specifically, on the sleek black card burning a hole in her apron pocket. Jackson Lancaster. She still couldn't believe he'd followed her out of that ballroom, let alone offered her a job. A millionaire restaurateur, asking her, a diner waitress, to work for him. The whole thing was absurd. He had no reason to seek her out, no reason to offer her anything. And yet, he had. Genesis? She blinked, snapping back to reality. Miss Bell, the cafe's owner, stood at the register, giving her a knowing look. You've been stuck in that same spot for 5 minutes, sugar. Either that sugar dispenser is giving you life advice, or you got something heavy on your mind. Genesis forced a laugh, shaking her head. Just tired. Miss Bell wasn't buying it. She never did. You're a terrible liar, she said, drying her hands on a rag. What's his name? Genesis hesitated, but before she could answer, the cafe door swung open, sending a gust of cool night air rushing inside. Her heart stopped, because there, standing in the doorway like he belonged in this world, was Jackson Lancaster. The entire diner fell silent. Not because anyone recognized him. Most people in this part of town didn't brush shoulders with Savannah's elite, but because he stood out like a misplaced puzzle piece. dressed in a tailored charcoal grey suit, top button undone, sleeves casually rolled up. Jackson looked effortlessly powerful, like a man who never heard the word no. And yet, he was looking straight at her. Genesis felt her pulse kick up, a mix of shock, curiosity, and a flicker of something else she didn't want to name. Miss Bell followed her gaze, then whistled under her breath. Well, that's not a face we usually see around here. Jackson walked toward the counter, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. Coffee, he said, sliding into a stool. Black. Genesis narrowed her eyes. We don't serve billionaire blends here. You sure you can handle diner coffee? Jackson smirked. Guess I'll find out. Miss Bell arched a brow, but didn't say a word. Instead, she grabbed the coffee pot and poured him a cup before retreating to the back, leaving Genesis alone with him. She crossed her arms. Are you following me now? Jackson took a slow sip of coffee, his expression unreadable. If I say yes, will you throw this in my face? She let out an exasperated laugh. I might. He set the cup down, watching her. I was hungry. You own 3 restaurants, Lancaster. And yet I found myself here. She shook her head, but she couldn't deny the way her stomach flipped. He was too calm, too composed, like he was playing a game she didn't know the rules to. Jackson studied her for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to make her feel like this conversation wasn't meant for anyone else. You thought about it, didn't you? Genesis stilled. What? My offer. His gaze flicked to her apron pocket, where the card was still tucked away. You haven't thrown it out. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but he wasn't. Instead, she grabbed a plate and slid a fresh biscuit in front of him. Eat something before you start believing your own charm. Jackson chuckled, but picked up the biscuit anyway. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. Damn. What? His lips quirked. This is better than half the stuff on my menu. She rolled her eyes. Flattery won't work. Not flattery, just fact. There was something disarming about the way he said it, like he genuinely meant it, and that, more than anything, threw her off balance. Before she could respond, the door swung open again, and Brittany Carter walked in, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Hey, Jen. She stopped mid-step, her gaze landing on Jackson. Why is there a rich guy in our booth? Genesis groaned. Britt, not now. Brittany, never one to be ignored, slid into the seat next to Jackson, arms crossed. You lost, mister. Jackson, to his credit, looked amused. Not yet. Genesis shot Brittany a look. Go to bed. You got school in the morning. Brittany smirked. And miss this? No way. Jackson turned to her. Brittany, right? She raised a brow. How do you know my name? He tapped his fingers against the counter. I know things. Brittany turned to Genesis. He's weird. Jackson laughed. A real, genuine laugh. And for a moment, Genesis forgot why this whole situation was a bad idea. Because it didn't feel like she was talking to a billionaire CEO. It felt like she was talking to someone who actually saw her. Still, she knew better. She had to. Genesis exhaled and placed both hands on the counter. Look, Jackson, I appreciate the offer, but... Say yes. She blinked. What? Say yes, he repeated, calm and steady. You're wasting your talent here. Her throat tightened. You don't know anything about me. I know you made this biscuit, and it's better than what my Michelin-starred chefs are serving. That doesn't mean I belong in your world. Jackson tilted his head. Maybe I don't belong in mine either. That did something to her, something she didn't like. Before she could process it, he pulled out a business card, a different one this time, white, minimalist. Just his number. Call me, he said, placing it on the counter, when you're ready. Genesis didn't move, didn't breathe. Jackson slid off the stool, nodding once at Brittany before heading for the door, and just like that, he was gone. For a long moment, she just stared at the card. "You're gonna take it," Brittany said. Genesis shook her head. "No, I'm not." Brittany smirked. "You're lying." Genesis let out a frustrated breath. "Go to bed, Britt." But later that night, when she was alone in her room, she pulled the card from her pocket. And for the first time, she wondered if saying no was the biggest mistake of her life. The scent of coffee and warm butter filled Magnolia Cafe as the early morning rush began. Genesis moved swiftly behind the counter, taking orders, refilling cups, and pretending she hadn't spent half the night staring at Jackson Lancaster's business card. She had tucked it into the back of her dresser drawer before Brittany could notice. Out of sight, out of mind. Or at least, that's what she told herself. She wasn't going to take the job. That was final. And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about it. "Jen, you good?" She startled at the voice, turning to see Luke Dawson, Magnolia's chef and her closest friend, watching her with suspicion. "Yeah," she said quickly, wiping down the counter. "Why?" He leaned against the pass window, arms crossed. "You've been acting weird since last night, and don't say you haven't, because you refilled the same coffee cup 3 times without realizing it." Genesis groaned, rubbing a hand down her face. "It's nothing." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Lying to me now? That's new." Before she could respond, the cafe door swung open, letting in a rush of warm, humid air. Genesis didn't have to look up to know who it was, because suddenly, the entire place felt different. Conversations dipped into hushed murmurs. Eyes flickered toward the entrance. She could feel his presence before she saw him. Jackson Lancaster had just walked into Magnolia Cafe again. Genesis clenched her jaw. Unbelievable. He was wearing a navy button-down, sleeves rolled up just like last night, but this time with dark jeans and an expensive watch peeking from beneath his cuff. He looked casual, effortless, but out of place, as if the world had tilted slightly just to accommodate him. He walked straight to the counter, ignoring the quiet stares. "I'll take a coffee," he said smoothly, eyes locked on her. Black. Genesis grabbed a mug, pretending her hands weren't trembling as she poured. She slid it in front of him. "You know, for a man who owns 3 high-end restaurants, you sure do slum it at diners a lot." Jackson smirked. "Maybe I like the company." Luke stepped beside her, arms still crossed. "That's so." Jackson glanced at him briefly, then back to Genesis. "I don't like repeating myself." Genesis huffed out a laugh. "You don't like hearing no either, do you?" His smirk didn't fade. "I prefer negotiating." Luke frowned. What's he talking about? Genesis didn't answer, but Jackson did. "I offered her a job." Silent. Luke turned to her, eyes narrowing. "And you didn't think to mention that?" Genesis sighed. "Because I already turned him down." Jackson tilted his head. "Not officially. I ignored your card, but you didn't throw it away." She hated how easily he read her. Luke stepped forward, voice firm. "She's not interested." Jackson barely looked at him. "She can speak for herself." Genesis felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hated how the air between them had thickened, how Luke's protective stance was starting to make this feel like something it wasn't. She exhaled, gripping the counter. "Look, Jackson, I appreciate the offer, but my life doesn't fit in your world." His eyes softened, just slightly. "What if I told you mine doesn't either?" Something about the way he said it made her chest tighten. But before she could respond, Haley Sterling walked into the cafe. Genesis felt her stomach drop. Dressed in a cream silk dress and designer heels, Haley looked as though she'd never stepped foot in a place like Magnolia. She took one glance around, lip curling slightly, before striding over to where Jackson sat. "Well," she drawled, resting a manicured hand on his shoulder. I was hoping to find you somewhere normal, but here you are." Jackson barely reacted. "Haley," she flashed a tight smile, "you missed a board meeting this morning." "I was busy." Her eyes flickered toward Genesis. A slow, assessing glance that said everything without saying a word. Genesis clenched her fist behind the counter. She knew that look. It was the kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." Haley tilted her head at Jackson. "Are you really slumming it at a diner for coffee?" Jackson leaned back slightly. "And good company." Haley's lips twitched, just slightly. "How charming." Then, to Genesis, "So you're the one everyone's whispering about?" Genesis frowned. "Excuse me?" Haley let out a soft, practiced laugh. "Oh, sweetheart, you didn't think you'd get involved with Jackson Lancaster and people wouldn't talk, did you?" Genesis froze. Involved? Her eyes snapped to Jackson, waiting for him to correct her. To say something. Anything. But he didn't, which meant Haley was saying this on purpose. Genesis let out a short breath. "I don't know what you think is happening, but I'm not involved with Jackson." Haley gave a pointed smile. "Oh, darling, you don't have to explain anything to me." Her tone was too sweet, too polished. The way rich women spoke when they wanted you to know they were better than you. Genesis had seen 100 Haleys before. Women who only saw value in power and money. Women who thought anything outside their world was small, insignificant, and she refused to be one of them. She straightened, forcing a neutral expression. "I think you should take your coffee to go, Lancaster." For the first time, something flickered across Jackson's face. Haley, however, looked triumphant. Genesis didn't care. She turned on her heel and walked straight into the kitchen, leaving them both behind. Later that night, Genesis paced her bedroom, fingers tightly gripping Jackson's business card. She had spent the whole day furious, at him, at Haley, at the fact that she cared at all. She should have thrown the card out the second he walked into that cafe, but now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Thinking about his eyes when Haley spoke for him. Thinking about how, for the first time, he actually looked affected by her rejection. She shouldn't call. She wouldn't call. The card was already in her hand. Before she could talk herself out of it, she grabbed her phone and dialed the number. It rang twice. Then, Genesis. His voice was smooth, unsurprised, like he'd been expecting her. She closed her eyes, exhaling. "I'm not saying yes." There was a pause, then a slow, amused chuckle. "You just called me, Carter. That's not a no." The late-night air was thick with the scent of jasmine and rain-soaked pavement as Genesis gripped her phone tighter, pressing it closer to her ear. The steady hum of Jackson's voice on the other end sent an unwanted shiver down her spine. "You just called me, Carter. That's not a no." Genesis let out a slow, measured breath, pacing the narrow space of her bedroom. "It's not a yes either," she shot back. There was a pause. Then the faintest hint of a smirk in his voice. "You're still thinking about it." She hated that he was right. Hated even more that he knew he was right. Her fingers curled around the edge of her dresser. "I called to tell you that whatever you think is happening between us, it's not." Jackson's low chuckle sent heat creeping up her neck. Who said anything was happening? Genesis closed her eyes, cursing herself for even engaging in this conversation. He was playing with her, and she knew it. "I have a job," she said firmly, "and I like my job. You like waking up at dawn, serving coffee to people who leave pennies for tips, and running yourself into the ground just to keep your head above water." Her jaw tightened. "It's honest work. And what I'm offering you isn't? You don't even know if I can cook." "I tasted that biscuit, Genesis. You know how many chefs I've fired in the last 6 months?" She swallowed. "I don't care." "You should." There was something different in his voice now, less teasing, more serious. "Because I don't offer second chances, Carter, and I don't waste my time. something flickered inside her. A challenge. A dare. Genesis turned toward her window, watching the moonlight spill across the pavement outside. "So why are you wasting it on me?" For the first time, Jackson hesitated. The line stayed quiet for a beat too long, and she almost thought he had hung up. But then, in a voice softer than before, he said, "Because you don't belong there." Her breath caught, and that, more than anything else he'd said that night, scared her the most. The following afternoon, Genesis stood in front of Lancaster's fine dining, arms crossed over her chest, regretting every single life choice that had brought her here. Savannah's most exclusive restaurant loomed above her, its towering arched windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. She had passed by this place 1,000 times, seen the luxury cars pulling up, the kind of people who dined here in outfits that probably cost more than her mother's house, and now she was about to walk through its doors. She should leave, right now, walk away and never look back. But before she could, the glass doors swung open. Jackson, dressed in a dark grey suit, crisp white shirt, no tie, effortlessly confident, like he hadn't just spent the last 24 hours burrowing into her head. His gaze flicked over her. "You're late." Genesis arched a brow. "I didn't say I was coming. You called, that was enough." She let out a sharp breath, stepping forward. "This isn't a yes." He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Then it's a maybe." Before she could second-guess herself, she walked inside. The restaurant was even more breathtaking than she had imagined. Deep mahogany floors, gold chandeliers, velvet-lined booths, the kind of place where people whispered over 5-course meals, where silverware gleamed under candlelight. Jackson led her toward the open-concept kitchen, where chefs in pristine white coats moved with calculated precision. Pans sizzling, sauces whisking, plates arranged like works of art. She had never seen anything like it. A man with sharp eyes and a perpetually unimpressed expression glanced up. Matteo Ricci, Jackson's executive chef. He frowned. "She's not wearing a uniform." "She doesn't have one," Jackson said simply. "Yet," Genesis bristled, "I didn't say I was taking the job." Matteo smirked. "She's got an attitude. This should be fun." Genesis turned to Jackson. "I already have a boss with high blood pressure. I don't need another one." Jackson just crossed his arms. "Show him what you can do." Genesis stared at the spotless kitchen, the polished steel counters, the chefs who had probably trained in Paris, and felt something unexpected. Not intimidation, not fear, excitement. Matteo sighed. "We're already behind for tonight's service. Give us something simple." Jackson shook his head. "Let her make whatever she wants." Matteo looked annoyed, but Jackson was already turning toward her. "What's it gonna be, Carter?" Genesis glanced around, scanning ingredients, shelves, and trays of prepped vegetables. Then she walked to the fridge, pulled out eggs, buttermilk, fresh herbs. When she turned, she saw Matteo watching her like she was an experiment gone wrong. "You're making breakfast?" Genesis ignored him, grabbing flour from the shelf. "I'm making biscuits." Jackson smirked. Matteo rolled his eyes. "You do realize this is a fine dining." But then the butter hit the bowl. Then the flour dusted the counter. Then her hands moved, kneading, folding, pressing, the way her mother had taught her. And suddenly, nothing else in the room mattered. The kitchen faded. The weight of everyone's eyes disappeared. Genesis worked the way she had her whole life, from instinct, from memory, from heart. She didn't need training in Paris to know how to make food that made people feel something. When the biscuits went into the oven, she took a deep breath, stepping back. Matteo looked unimpressed. Jackson, however, was watching her like he had just solved a mystery he hadn't realized he needed to solve. 15 minutes later, she pulled out the flaky, golden brown biscuits, the scent of butter and rosemary filling the air. She placed them on a plate, drizzling a honey glaze on top, before sliding it toward Matteo. He didn't speak, didn't react. Just took a bite, chewed, paused. Then, slowly, he set the biscuit down. Genesis crossed her arms. Well, Matteo exhaled through his nose. They're good. She waited. A long beat of silence. Then, grudgingly, almost painfully, they're really damn good. Jackson's lips twitched. Matteo shot him a glare. Don't look at me like that, Jackson shrugged. I told you. Genesis arched a brow. So? Matteo sighed, rubbing his temples. Then, grumbling under his breath, fine, she can stay. Something inside Genesis thrilled at the words, but she kept her expression neutral, tilting her head at Jackson. This still isn't a yes. Jackson smirked. Of course not. But they both knew. She was already in. The kitchen at Lancaster's was nothing like Magnolia Cafe. It was fast, unforgiving. Every second mattered. Genesis barely had time to breathe. She had officially started 3 days ago, and in that time, she'd learned 2 things. 1. Matteo, the head chef, was impossible to please. 2. Jackson Lancaster was watching her, always. She felt it every time she moved through the kitchen. His gaze, sharp and calculating, as if he was waiting for her to prove him right. Or prove him wrong. She still didn't know which he wanted more. Genesis shook off the thought and focused on the dough in front of her. It was Friday night service, the busiest shift of the week, and she had exactly 4 minutes before Matteo lost his patience and barked another demand. Her hands worked fast, moving from memory, from instinct. Flour, butter, herbs, bake, serve, repeat. She was in the middle of plating when Matteo's voice cut through the kitchen. Stop. Genesis stilled, her fingers hovering over the dish. Matteo walked over, eyes scanning the plate. Too much garnish. Genesis frowned. It's fresh time. I didn't ask for a debate. Her jaw clenched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she adjusted the plating and slid the dish onto the pass. Matteo didn't say good. He just didn't send it back. That was the closest thing to approval she was going to get. She exhaled, stepping back just as Jackson walked into the kitchen. The room shifted instantly. Every chef straightened, movements tightening. Jackson Lancaster might own the restaurant, but he rarely stepped into the kitchen during service, which meant something was about to happen. Genesis wiped her hands on her apron, pretending she wasn't hyper-aware of him standing so close. Matteo, Jackson said smoothly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. How's she doing? Matteo barely glanced up from the plates. She listens. That's more than I can say for most of these idiots. Jackson smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. Matteo grumbled something under his breath before turning back to the grill. Genesis felt Jackson shift closer. So? His voice was lower now, just for her. How's your first week? Genesis kept her focus on the counter, refusing to look at him. I don't have time for small talk. Then let's make it big talk. She sighed. Jackson, I'm serious. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Are you adjusting? She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the flicker of amusement. I don't need you checking in on me. I disagree. She finally turned, narrowing her eyes. I'm not some lost stray you took in. Jackson held her gaze, unreadable. I never said you were. Something in the air shifted. Genesis swallowed. The noise of the kitchen faded, the world pulling tight around them. For a second, just 1 second, she forgot where she was. Forgot why she'd even walked into this job in the first place. Then Matteo's voice broke the spell. Lancaster. Jackson blinked, turning toward him. We're slammed. If you're done flirting, get out of my kitchen. Genesis felt her entire body freeze. The room went silent. Then, Jackson laughed. Actually laughed. It wasn't a soft chuckle. It was full, amused, and completely unbothered. I'll leave when I'm ready, Jackson said, smirking. Matteo snorted but didn't argue. Genesis, however, was mortified. The second Jackson turned back to her, she hissed, "You think this is funny?" His smirk didn't fade. "You don't? You're distracting me." He tilted his head. "You sure it's me that's the distraction?" She narrowed her eyes. His smirk deepened. Before she could fire back, Mateo barked another order, snapping her back to reality. Jackson stepped away, hands in his pockets. "Carry on, Carter." And then, just like that, he was gone. Genesis exhaled, pulse still racing. She had just made one major mistake. She had let Jackson Lancaster get into her head. Later that night, Genesis was the last one to leave. The restaurant was quiet now, the chaos of service long gone. She stepped into the cool night air, rolling her shoulders. Her entire body ached. She had just started walking toward her car when she noticed a familiar figure standing by the curb. Jackson, of course. He was leaning against his sleek black Audi, phone in hand, waiting. Genesis slowed, stopping a few feet away. "You stalking me now?" He barely looked up. "You were the last to leave?" She folded her arms. "And?" His gaze flicked to her, and I was waiting. Her stomach flipped. She didn't know what to do with that. Jackson pushed off the car, stepping closer. "You hungry?" Genesis hesitated. "Why?" He shrugged. "I don't feel like going home yet." She stared at him, waiting for the catch. There had to be one. There was always a catch with men like him, but all he said was, "Come on, Carter." One meal. And the worst part? She wanted to say yes. The neon glow of Savannah's dockside seafood shack flickered against the night sky, casting soft reflections over the water. It was past midnight, and the restaurant was nearly empty. Just a few fishermen nursing beers at the counter, the sound of distant waves breaking the silence. Genesis sat across from Jackson Lancaster, arms folded, eyeing him warily as he leaned back in the weathered wooden booth. "I still don't know why I agreed to this." Jackson smirked, reaching for the hot sauce. "Because you were hungry." She scoffed. "You just assume I have no self-control." He tipped the bottle over his plate, dousing his oysters in spice. "You agreed to dinner with me, didn't you?" Genesis rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. She hated that he could pull a reaction from her so easily. She glanced down at the battered shrimp and grits in front of her. The scent warm and familiar. This place was a far cry from Lancaster's fine dining. Here, there were no white tablecloths, no hushed tones, just the smell of fried seafood, the occasional yell from the kitchen, and the sound of an old jukebox crackling in the background. She liked it. "Didn't peg you for a place like this," she admitted, taking a bite. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "What did you peg me for?" She gestured vaguely. "5-star steakhouse, private chef, caviar at 2 a.m. His smirk deepened. "I hate caviar." Genesis scoffed. "Of course you do." Jackson leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "What about you?" She paused mid-bite. "What about me? What's the dream, Carter?" He gestured around the shack. "You planning on working at my restaurant forever?" Genesis exhaled, stirring the grits with her spoon. "It's a job." "That's not an answer." She glanced up, meeting his eyes. They weren't just watching her. They were studying her. It unsettled her. Genesis put down her fork. "I don't have time for dreams, Jackson. I have Brittany. I have bills. I have a house that's falling apart faster than I can fix it." She shook her head. "Dreams are for people who have room to fail." A beat of silence. Then, "You don't believe that." Her jaw clenched. "What do you know about my life?" Jackson didn't look away. "I know you don't belong at Magnolia Cafe." Genesis exhaled through her nose. "And you don't belong in that tuxedo you wore at the gala. But here we are." Jackson stilled. Something flickered in his expression. Something almost vulnerable. And that, more than anything, caught her off guard. She expected him to deflect. to smirk, to tease, to change the subject. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against his glass. "You're not wrong." Genesis frowned. "What?" "I don't belong in that world." He looked past her, out toward the docks, his voice quieter now. "But I built it anyway." She studied him, her own curiosity catching up with her. "Why?" Jackson's gaze flickered back to her, a slow smirk forming. "Now that's a conversation for another night." Genesis rolled her eyes. "Right, of course." The waitress approached, dropping the check between them. Genesis instinctively reached for it, but Jackson beat her to it, sliding his black metal card across the table. She glared at him. "I could have paid." Jackson smirked, lazily signing the receipt. "I know." Genesis crossed her arms. "You're impossible." "And yet here we are." She exhaled sharply, pushing back from the table. "I should go." Jackson stood as well, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "I'll drive you." Genesis shook her head. "I drove myself." He smirked. "And yet here I am." She narrowed her eyes. "Stop doing that." "Doing what?" "Acting like I can't resist you." Jackson grinned, and she hated that it was a good one. "Can you?" She let out a slow breath. "Good night, Lancaster." He didn't stop her as she walked out, but as she climbed into her car, hands gripping the wheel, she caught sight of him through the window. Jackson Lancaster, watching her leave. And that, more than anything else, was dangerous. The late afternoon sun bathed Lancaster's fine dining in a golden hue, casting long shadows through the towering windows. The restaurant wasn't open yet, but the kitchen was already in full motion, the rhythmic clang of pots and the scent of simmering sauces filling the air. Genesis moved swiftly, her hands working on instinct, slicing fresh herbs with practiced precision. She had been at this job long enough now to find her rhythm, to block out the chaos of fine dining and settle into her own space. At least, she tried to. But ever since that night at the seafood shack, Jackson Lancaster had been taking up too much space in her head. She hated it, hated that she kept replaying his words, his smirks, the way his voice had dropped to something unreadable when he said, "I don't belong in that world either." It was ridiculous. This wasn't a thing. It wasn't anything. She was just here to cook. "Carter." Mateo's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. She looked up just as he set a stack of printed menus onto the counter beside her. "Special event this weekend," he said gruffly. "New menu. You're handling the starters." Genesis wiped her hands on her apron and grabbed one of the menus, scanning the elegant font. And then her stomach dropped. The Sterling Foundation polo match. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Of course, Haley Sterling would find a way to slither back into this. She should have known. She exhaled sharply and set the menu back down. "Got it." Mateo eyed her. "You good?" She forced a nod. "Yeah, fine." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. "Good, because I don't have time for distractions." Neither do I, she thought bitterly, but the universe clearly didn't care. That evening, Genesis stood outside Lancaster's, arms crossed, debating whether she had the energy to deal with what was coming. Because he was waiting for her, Jackson. Leaning against the sleek black Aston Martin, sleeves rolled up, watching her like he already knew something was wrong. Of course he did. She took a slow breath, pushing past the unwelcome warmth creeping up her neck, and walked toward him. "You knew." Jackson arched a brow. "Knew what?" She tossed the menu at him. He caught it effortlessly, glancing down before meeting her gaze again. "The Sterling event," she clarified, folding her arms. "You knew I'd have to cook for her." His expression didn't change. "It's just another event." Genesis scoffed. "Don't insult me." Jackson exhaled and stepped closer, just enough that she could feel the shift in energy between them. "She's nothing, Genesis." The way he said her name made something in her chest tighten. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. You really don't get it, do you? She's not just nothing. She's everything that made me feel like I don't belong in this world. Jackson's jaw tensed. And do you? She blinked. What? Do you feel like you belong here? Her throat went dry. Because the truth, she didn't know. Before she could answer, Jackson's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen and sighed. Let me guess, Genesis muttered. Haley. Jackson didn't respond immediately. Then, with a slow exhale, he said, She's been asking me to meet her. Genesis felt something sharp lodge itself in her ribs. She shouldn't care. She didn't care. But the word still felt like an anchor sinking in her stomach. Well, she said, forcing a neutral tone. Looks like you have plans then. Jackson's eyes flicked up, studying her for a moment too long. Then, without a word, he silenced the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. Genesis swallowed. Jackson tilted his head. What were you saying? She hated him. She hated how effortlessly he made her breath catch, how easily he unsettled her. But most of all, she hated that she couldn't look away. After a long pause, she exhaled sharply. I have work to do. Jackson smirked. Then you better get to it, Carter. And as she turned and walked back inside, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The scent of seared rosemary and citrus filled the kitchen of Lancaster's. But Genesis barely noticed. Her hands moved with precision, rolling, kneading, cutting. But her mind was elsewhere. The Sterling Foundation polo match was tomorrow. And Jackson Lancaster had ignored Haley's call right in front of her. Genesis scowled at the thought. It didn't mean anything. It shouldn't mean anything. Jackson was a businessman, calculated, methodical. He played chess while the rest of the world scrambled to keep up. Whatever he was doing with her, this attention, this game, this distraction, it wasn't real. But then why did it feel like it was? Carter. She flinched slightly, blinking up as Mateo stopped beside her, arms crossed. You good? He asked, watching her too closely. Genesis nodded stiffly. Fine. Mateo studied her a second longer, then reached for a plated dish, inspecting it with his usual unimpressed expression. The Sterling event is a big deal, he muttered. We can't afford distractions. Her jaw clenched. I'm not distracted. Mateo hummed, like he didn't quite believe her. Before she could argue, the kitchen door swung open. Every chef stilled, tension snapping into the air as Haley Sterling walked in like she owned the place. Genesis felt her entire body go rigid. Haley didn't belong in kitchens. Her world was white linens and quiet elegance, whispered deals over caviar and champagne. And yet, there she was, in a form-fitting ivory dress, standing like she was doing everyone a favor just by breathing the same air. Mateo's expression darkened. The hell is she doing back here? Haley barely spared him a glance before her gaze found Genesis. And just like that, Genesis knew exactly why she was here. She was here for her. Genesis set down her knife, steadying herself before stepping forward. Miss Sterling, you're not supposed to be back here. Haley gave a small, effortless smile. Oh, I know. But I figured since my foundation is hosting this little event, I should check on the menu personally. Mateo exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. We don't do custom orders, Sterling. Haley ignored him, still watching Genesis. I have to admit, she mused, tapping a manicured nail against her chin. When I heard Jackson hired you, I was surprised. Genesis kept her face blank. Why's that? Haley's smile was slow, deliberate. Because Jackson doesn't usually invest in things that aren't profitable. Something sharp twisted in Genesis's chest. Mateo muttered a curse under his breath. The entire kitchen was watching now, the tension like static in the air. Genesis lifted her chin. I'm sorry, Miss Sterling, but I have work to do. She turned, because if she stayed here a second longer, she might actually throw a spoon in Haley's direction. But before she could walk away, Haley's voice rang out. "I suppose every empire needs charity cases." Silent. Genesis stopped mid-step. The room froze. Mateo's grip on the counter tightened. A sous chef muttered something under his breath. But Genesis didn't turn around. She wouldn't give Haley the satisfaction. Instead, she took a slow breath and kept walking. Genesis's shift ended 2 hours later, but she didn't leave. She sat on the back steps of Lancaster's, the warm night air pressing against her skin, her hands curled into fists. She had been humiliated before. She'd been talked down to, overlooked, treated like an outsider. But something about Haley's words stuck. Because deep down, wasn't that what Jackson was doing? He had seen her at that gala, helpless, humiliated, struggling, and now, suddenly, she was his little project. Maybe Haley was right. Maybe this was charity. The thought made her stomach turn. Long night. Genesis stiffened. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Jackson's voice was smoother than the night air, carrying over the silence as he stepped onto the pavement beside her. She let out a slow breath, not looking at him. "She came here for me." Jackson was quiet for a moment. "I know." That made something in her chest tighten. Genesis clenched her jaw. "She thinks I'm a joke." Jackson sat beside her, close, but not touching. "She wants you to think that." His voice was calm, even. "Because the moment you stop thinking it, she loses." Genesis finally turned to him. "And what do you think?" Jackson held her gaze. Then, softly, simply, "I think you're the only real thing in that kitchen." The words sank into her like a weight, because he didn't say she was talented, didn't say she was smart, or capable, or hard-working. He said she was real. Genesis swallowed. "Jackson." He watched her, quiet, unmoving, waiting. She didn't know what she wanted to say. Or maybe she did, and that was the problem. She exhaled and looked away. "I should go." Jackson studied her for a long moment before nodding once. She stood up, brushing the dust off her apron, but as she turned, he spoke again. "Genesis." She hesitated. Then, his voice lower now, barely above a whisper, "She doesn't get to define you." Genesis' fingers tightened at her sides. She left without another word. But that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized something. For the first time since she'd stepped into Lancaster's, she wanted to win. Not because she had to, not because she was trying to prove something to Haley, but because Jackson Lancaster had looked her in the eye and said she was real. And for some reason, she wanted him to be right. The morning of the Sterling Foundation polo match arrived, and Lancaster's fine dining was a storm of movement. The kitchen pulsed with the frantic energy of chefs moving in perfect, calculated chaos, the sound of sizzling pans, and the sharp clatter of knives filling the space. Genesis had never worked under pressure like this before, not at Magnolia, not anywhere. Everything had to be perfect, and for the first time she wanted it to be. Not for Haley, not even for Jackson, but for herself. She had been in this kitchen for weeks now, and every moment had been a fight to prove she belonged. If she let Haley Sterling, or anyone else, make her doubt that today, then she never would. Mateo barked an order from the other side of the room, dragging her back to reality. "Starters out in 10. Genesis grabbed a plate, her hands moving on instinct, precision, memory. She had worked all night refining her dish, ensuring every bite carried the perfect balance of flavor, texture, and artistry. She plated the first batch of roasted peach and goat cheese crostini, drizzling it lightly with a balsamic glaze before sending it off to the waiting servers. Mateo passed behind her, glancing at her work. He didn't say good job, didn't nod in approval. But he didn't send the plates back. and that was enough. By the time Genesis stepped out of the kitchen and into the event grounds, the match was already in full swing. The sight before her was a world she had never belonged to. Rows of white tents lined the lush green fields, filled with Savannah's elite. Women draped in silk and wide-brimmed hats. Men in tailored suits, sipping champagne under the late afternoon sun. Her stomach twisted, an old familiar tension creeping in. She didn't want to be here. She wanted to be in the kitchen, where she belonged. And then, just as she was about to turn back, she saw him, Jackson Lancaster, standing near the VIP section, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable, and beside him, Haley Sterling. Genesis froze. Haley was leaning in close, a hand lightly resting on Jackson's arm. Her laugh perfectly rehearsed, her body angled like she was staking a claim. Genesis told herself it didn't matter, it wasn't her business, and yet her hands curled into fists at her sides. She shouldn't have come outside. That was her mistake. Genesis had barely been out here for 5 minutes before a waiter from the catering staff approached, his expression tight. "There's an issue," he said, glancing at her name tag. "Are you Genesis Carter?" Her stomach dropped. "Yes." "It's about one of the dishes." Of course it was. Without another word, she followed him through the crowd, heart pounding in her chest. The second she stepped into the VIP tent, she knew. The table was filled with guests, plates half finished in front of them, and at the head of the table sat Haley Sterling, her expression poised but victorious. Genesis clenched her jaw. This was a setup, a deliberate, calculated trap. "Ah," Haley said smoothly, lifting her wine glass. "There she is." Genesis folded her arms. "What's the problem?" Haley let out a soft, practiced laugh. "I was just telling everyone how charming it is that Lancaster's is experimenting with comfort food." There was an edge to her voice, one Genesis recognized. This wasn't about the food. This was about her. Genesis forced a neutral expression. "If you have feedback on the dish, I'd be happy to hear it." Haley gave a slow, deliberate smile. "Oh, I wouldn't call it feedback." She lifted her fork, pushing the untouched crostini toward Genesis. "Go ahead," she said, her voice all honey and silk. "Try it yourself." The message was clear. Prove you belong here. Genesis' pulse roared in her ears. She should have seen this coming. Should have known that Haley wouldn't let someone like her succeed without taking a shot. And for a second, a brief, fleeting second, she considered walking away. But then, "Is there a problem?" The voice was smooth, low, and far too familiar. Genesis turned, her breath catching slightly. Jackson. He was standing at the edge of the tent, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Haley's smile barely faltered. "Not at all," she said lightly. "We were just discussing the menu." Jackson's gaze flicked to Genesis, then to the untouched plate. The air tightened, and then, without breaking eye contact, he picked up Haley's fork and took a bite. The room went silent. Jackson chewed slowly, savoring the flavors. Then, after a long pause, he set the fork down and leaned in slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "I've eaten in the best restaurants in the world," he said, quietly, "and I'd still rather eat something Genesis Carter made." Genesis stopped breathing. Haley's smile finally cracked. A muscle in her jaw ticked as she exhaled sharply through her nose, reaching for her wine glass in an attempt to look unfazed. "Of course," she murmured, swirling the liquid. "You always did have a soft spot for charity work." Jackson's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, his voice just for Haley now. "Careful," he said softly. "You're getting desperate." The words landed hard, sharp, deliberate, and for the first time, Haley had no response. Genesis stared at him, something unreadable twisting in her chest. Jackson's gaze flickered back to her, steady, unwavering. He had done that for her. He didn't have to, but he did. And now, standing there, in a room where she was never meant to belong, Genesis realized something. She wasn't going anywhere. Not for Haley. Not for Jackson. But for herself. Because for the first time in her life, she wanted to fight for something that was hers. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. The scent of freshly baked crostini still clung to Genesis's hands as she stepped out of the Sterling Foundation polo match tent, her heart pounding a little too fast. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting golden streaks across the manicured grass, but all she could hear was Jackson's voice. I'd still rather eat something Genesis Carter made. He hadn't just defended her cooking, he had made a statement, a public one, in front of the kind of people who could ruin reputations with a single whispered conversation. And the way he had looked at her. Genesis exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. This was getting dangerous. You're thinking too hard, a voice said behind her. She turned to see Mateo, arms crossed, watching her with his usual unimpressed expression. That was a disaster, she muttered, rubbing her temples. Mateo snorted. That was nothing. Sterling thought she could embarrass you, and she failed. You should be celebrating. Genesis shot him a look. I don't celebrate being someone's pawn in a power game. Mateo tilted his head slightly. And Lancaster. Is he playing a game with you? She stiffened. That's different. He studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. You keep telling yourself that, Carter. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, a shadow crossed her vision. Jackson. Walking toward her, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Mateo glanced between them and let out a low breath. And that's my cue to get back to the kitchen. Don't do anything stupid, Carter. Genesis barely had time to glare at him before he disappeared into the tent. Now, it was just her and Jackson. The air between them felt different now, charged, unspoken. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. You okay? She let out a dry laugh. You mean after being publicly tested like a school project? Jackson smirked. You passed. Genesis crossed her arms. That's not the point, Jackson. Then what is? She exhaled, frustration knotting in her chest. You keep stepping in, fixing things, fighting my battles. What happens when you're not there? His smirk faded. Good. Maybe he'd finally understand. I don't need you to rescue me, she said, voice softer now. I need to do this on my own. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he took a step closer. You really think I don't know that? Her breath caught. Jackson's voice was lower now, quieter. I know exactly who you are, Genesis. I know you don't need me to fight your battles. His gaze flickered over her face, searching. But I want to, he admitted. The words landed deep. Genesis stared at him, heartbeat hammering in her ears. Why? She whispered. Jackson exhaled slowly, his fingers grazing his jaw before looking at her again. Because I don't want you to fight alone. The air between them pulled tight. Genesis swallowed hard, her pulse a wild, erratic thing in her chest. This was too much, too close, too real. She took a slow step back, shaking her head. I can't. Before she could finish, her phone rang. She blinked, fumbling for it, grateful for the sudden distraction, until she saw the name on the screen. Brittany. Her stomach twisted. She never called during work hours unless something was wrong. Genesis quickly answered. Britt, what's... Jen, Brittany's voice came through, sharp, panicked. Something's happening with the house. You need to come home now. The ground tilted beneath her. Jackson's expression shifted instantly. Genesis! She barely heard him. She was already moving, already running, because she knew. Even before Brittany said it, Even before the words cut through the static in her mind, she knew. She was about to lose everything. Rain hit the windshield in steady, rhythmic drops as Genesis gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The road ahead blurred, streetlights casting sharp streaks through the downpour. The sound of Brittany's panicked voice still echoed in her ears. "Something's happening with the house. You need to come home, now." Her chest felt too tight. She didn't know what she would find when she got there, but the way Brittany had sounded, shaken, scared, urgent, made it clear. This wasn't just another bill she couldn't pay. This was worse. A movement in the passenger seat pulled her attention. Jackson sat beside her, silent but watchful. She still didn't know why she let him come. One second she'd been running to her car. The next, he was opening the passenger door, sliding in without asking. She should have told him no, should have told him this wasn't his problem. But she didn't. Because right now, she couldn't afford to think about him. She could only think about what was waiting for her at home. A heavy breath escaped her lips. "You didn't have to come." Jackson's gaze stayed on the road. "I know." The weight of those two words settled deep in her chest. Genesis didn't answer. She just drove. By the time they pulled up to the small two-bedroom house on the outskirts of Savannah, Genesis could barely breathe. Her home, her mother's home, was drowning in shadows, the porch light flickering weakly against the storm. Brittany stood on the steps, arms wrapped around herself, biting her lip. Genesis was out of the car before the engine even cut off. "Britt!" Her shoes splashed against the pavement as she ran toward her sister, Jackson, right behind her. Brittany spun around, her expression flickering between relief and guilt. I didn't know what to do," she stammered, her voice tight. "The guy just showed up, General. He said—" "What guy?" Genesis demanded, gripping Brittany's arms. "Who is here?" Brittany hesitated, her throat bobbing. Then, she glanced behind Genesis, at Jackson. Genesis felt it immediately. The shift, the weight, and then, understanding slammed into her like a freight train. Brittany wasn't just looking at Jackson. She was looking past him. Genesis slowly turned, and there, standing under the dim porch light, dressed in a perfectly pressed suit, holding a folder of paperwork in one hand and an expensive umbrella in the other, Warren Lancaster. The air went still. Even the rain seemed to hesitate, suspended between one breath and the next. Jackson's jaw locked. Genesis's stomach plummeted. Warren's lips curled into something that might have been a smile. "Miss Carter," he greeted smoothly. "We finally meet." Genesis swallowed, her pulse roaring. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an accident. Warren Lancaster was here for a reason, and she already knew what it was. Jackson stepped forward, his voice sharp. "What the hell are you doing here?" Warren didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Genesis. "I assume Brittany told you," he said casually, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Your time is up, Miss Carter." Genesis's breath hitched. "Number no. Her hands curled into fists. "You're lying." Warren sighed, opening the folder. "You've been behind on your payments for months. The bank has finished waiting. This property has officially been transferred to—" "Don't." Genesis cut him off, her voice shaking. She couldn't hear it, couldn't listen to the words that would take away the only home she had left. Warren tilted his head, watching her with mild curiosity, like he was observing something inevitable. "You must have known this was coming," he said, not unkindly. "Delinquent payments, stagnant income, a sister to provide for. You've been holding on to something that was never meant to be yours forever." Genesis's heart slammed against her ribs. Her throat burned, but she refused to break. Not in front of him. She lifted her chin. "You don't know anything about me." Warren studied her for a long moment. Then, he finally glanced at Jackson. "Does she know?" he asked mildly. Jackson's posture stiffened. Genesis frowned. "What?" Warren exhaled, shaking his head. Of course not. You wouldn't tell her, would you? Genesis's stomach twisted. Tell me what? Jackson's silence was too loud. Something was wrong. She could feel it. Warren's gaze flicked back to her. Lancaster's is expanding, he said, smooth and deliberate. Jackson just finalized a deal for the next location. Genesis blinked, confusion knotting in her chest. And, she snapped, what does that have to do with my house? Warren's smirk was slow, amused. You mean you don't know? He took a step forward, lowering his voice just enough to feel like a secret. He bought this block, Miss Carter. The world tilted. Genesis felt the air leave her lungs. No, that wasn't. Her eyes snapped to Jackson. He was silent. Her pulse thundered. You didn't, she whispered, shaking her head. Tell me you didn't. Jackson's jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, but he didn't deny it. He didn't say no. That was all the answer she needed. Genesis staggered back. She felt like she was drowning, like the last few months had been a carefully constructed illusion, and she had just seen the truth for the first time. Everything, the job, the offer, the help, hadn't been about her. It had been about this, her home, her life. Her hands shook. Brittany, she choked out. Go inside. Jen, go! Her voice cracked. Brittany hesitated, then turned and fled into the house. Now it was just her, Jackson, and the man who had just ripped her world apart. Warren sighed, clicking the folder shut. I'll leave you to it then. Then, without another word, he stepped back into the rain, disappearing into a waiting black car. Silence. Genesis stood frozen, her entire body numb. Jackson took a step toward her. Genesis, don't. Her voice came out raw, hollow. Jackson stilled. Genesis lifted her eyes, burning, furious, shattered. I trusted you. Jackson's expression cracked. She shook her head, tears threatening to spill. I was stupid enough to believe you saw me as more than some problem to fix. Jackson exhaled sharply. It wasn't like that. Then what was it? She whispered. His jaw clenched, but he didn't have an answer. Genesis swallowed the lump in her throat, stepping back. I don't need your help, Jackson. Her voice wavered. I never did. And then, before he could say another word, she turned and walked inside, leaving him standing in the rain. The rain pounded against the windows, the steady rhythm filling the silence of the house. Genesis sat on the couch, staring at the eviction notice in her trembling hands. The paper felt too thin, too light for something so heavy. Across the room, Brittany sat curled into herself, knees pulled to her chest, eyes red from crying. Neither of them spoke. Because what was there to say? Their home, the one thing Genesis had fought so hard to keep, was slipping through her fingers. And Jackson. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing away the sting in her chest. She had been stupid, so unbelievably stupid. She should have known, should have seen it coming. All this time, she thought she had been building something real at Lancaster's. Thought Jackson had seen her as more than a project, more than a charity case. But in the end, he had been playing a game she never even knew she was part of. A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Genesis flinched. Brittany's head snapped up. If that's Warren Lancaster again, I swear to... But Genesis already knew who it was. Her hands curled into fists as she stood, storming toward the door. The second she swung it open, she wasn't surprised. Jackson, standing on her porch, rain dripping from his hair, his shirt damp and clinging to his frame. His eyes searched hers, something desperate, something raw. Genesis! She slammed the door in his face. The knock came again, firmer this time. Genesis opened the door. Go away. I'm not leaving. Genesis let out a bitter laugh, pressing her forehead against the wood. Of course he wasn't. Another knock. Please. She clenched her jaw, every nerve in her body screaming at her to ignore him, to let him stand there in the rain, to let him feel even a fraction of what she was feeling. But the part of her that still wanted answers, the part that still wanted him, was louder. With a deep, shaky breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Jackson stepped forward immediately, but she lifted a hand. "Don't," she warned. He stilled, tension rolling off him in waves. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" she snapped, voice sharp and dangerously close to breaking. "That I was just some problem you were trying to solve. That this whole time I was." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I should have known," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Jackson flinched. "I wasn't trying to take your home." His voice was low, urgent. "I didn't know." Genesis' breath hitched. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not." His hands clenched at his sides. "I knew about the expansion, but I didn't know your house was part of the deal. That was Warren." Her stomach twisted. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But trust wasn't something she could afford anymore. She swallowed hard. "Does it even matter, whether you knew or not?" His jaw tightened. "It matters to me." The words hung between them, heavy and thick. Genesis shook her head. "I can't do this, Jackson." He stepped closer. "Yes, you can." She sucked in a breath. "You don't get it. I spent my whole life fighting to keep this house, to keep Brittany safe, to prove that I don't need saving." His gaze softened, but she wasn't done. "And then you showed up," she whispered, "and I let myself think for one stupid second that you actually saw me, that you actually—" Her voice broke. Jackson moved before she could stop him. 1 second, he was standing in the rain. The next, he was in front of her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, feel the weight of everything unsaid. "I do see you," he murmured. Genesis' breath caught. He reached up, fingertips barely grazing her cheek, like he was afraid she'd pull away. And maybe she should have. But she didn't. Because for all the hurt, all the betrayal, all the chaos, this moment still felt real, and that terrified her. She let out a shaky breath. "Jackson, I'll fix this." His voice was rough, like he wasn't used to making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "I don't care what it takes, I'll fix it." Genesis squeezed her eyes shut. "You can't fix everything." "I can fix this." She opened her mouth, to argue, to push him away, to say something that would make this hurt less. But before she could, Brittany's voice rang out behind her. "What if we don't want your help?" Genesis stiffened, stepping back as her sister walked into view, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jackson's expression didn't change. "Then I'll find another way." Brittany huffed a bitter laugh. "Of course you will." Genesis turned to her. "Britt—" "No," Brittany cut in, eyes burning. "He doesn't get to come here, make promises, and pretend like he isn't part of the reason we're in this mess." Jackson didn't flinch, didn't back down. Instead, he looked at Genesis. "Tell me you don't want my help," he said quietly, "and I'll walk away." Genesis's heart pounded. This was it. The moment she could end this. She could tell him to leave. Let him disappear. Let him take his world and his money and his power and go. She could finally be done with him, but she wasn't. Because the truth was, she didn't want him to go. She hated him for what had happened. Hated that he had kept things from her. Hated that she had let herself fall into this mess. But somehow, against all logic and reason, she still trusted him. She lifted her chin. "What's your plan?" Jackson's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "Let me handle Warren." Genesis folded her arms. "And what does that mean?" "I'll make him an offer." She narrowed her eyes. "What kind of offer?" Jackson exhaled. "The kind that makes sure this house stays yours." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Genesis spoke. If I agree to this, I do it my way. Jackson nodded. Your way. Brittany let out a sharp breath. Jen. Genesis looked at her sister, something steady in her gaze. We're out of options, Brit. Brittany's shoulders sagged. I hate this. Genesis swallowed. I know. She turned back to Jackson, forcing herself to ignore the way her heart was racing. One chance, she warned. You get one chance to fix this. Jackson's lips twitched. Just barely. One's all I need. Genesis wasn't sure if that was a promise or a warning. But either way, there was no turning back now. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, but Genesis hadn't taken a sip. She sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the ceramic mug, her mind a tangled mess of thoughts. Across from her, Brittany was silent, arms folded tightly across her chest. The tension between them had settled into something heavy, something neither of them knew how to shake off. I still don't trust him, Brittany muttered, breaking the quiet. Genesis exhaled, rubbing a hand down her face. I know. You shouldn't either. Genesis swallowed. I don't. It was half a lie, because even now, even after everything, a part of her still did, and she hated that. The soft hum of an engine outside made Brittany sit up straighter, her lips pressing into a thin line. Guess Prince Charming's here. Genesis ignored her and stood, her pulse kicking up as she made her way to the front door. Jackson was waiting. He leaned against his car, dressed in his usual effortless confidence, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. But there was something in his posture, something different, tension, a weight he wasn't bothering to hide. Genesis folded her arms. Tell me you have good news. Jackson pushed off the car, stepping closer. I have a meeting with Warren in an hour. Her stomach twisted. And I know how to make him take the deal. Genesis studied him. She could read people. She had spent her whole life watching body language, searching for the truth beneath the surface. And right now, Jackson Lancaster was holding something back. What's the catch? She asked quietly. Jackson's jaw ticked. The deal will cost me. Genesis frowned. Cost you what? He hesitated, just for a second. But that second was long enough. She took a slow step forward. Jackson. His throat bobbed. Warren doesn't do favors. If I want him to walk away from your house, I have to give him something bigger. Genesis's stomach dropped. What are you giving him? Silence. Then, Jackson exhaled. My stake in Lancaster's. The world tilted. Genesis stared at him, her mind struggling to process the words. What? Jackson's voice was calm, steady, like he had already made peace with it. He wants control. If I step back, he'll take the offer and leave your house alone. Genesis felt like she was breathing through water. This restaurant, his empire, was his life, and he was willing to give it up. For her. Her fingers curled into fists. No. Jackson arched a brow. No? You can't do this. I can. She shook her head, voice wavering. Jackson, this is your entire career. His lips tugged into a small, humorless smirk. And you were willing to walk away from yours. Genesis' breath caught. She had spent her entire life trying to survive, trying to hold on to something of her own. And now Jackson was standing here, ready to give up everything. For her. For this. Her throat burned. You don't have to do this. Jackson's gaze softened. I want to. Genesis's chest tightened. She shook her head. You're crazy. His smirk deepened. That's what Mateo said. Genesis let out a strangled laugh, but it came out more like a sigh. She didn't know how to feel, didn't know how to stop him. Jackson took a slow step closer, voice lower now. Let me do this, Genesis. Her pulse pounded. She could tell him no, could tell him she didn't want him to fix this, didn't need him to. But they both knew it wasn't true. and that terrified her. She swallowed. Jackson. His gaze searched hers. I'll fix it. She didn't have words, so she nodded, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of losing her house. She was afraid of what happened after, because if Jackson gave up Lancasters, what was left for them? And why did that thought hurt more than anything? The scent of espresso and polished mahogany filled the private lounge at Lancaster's Fine Dining. But Genesis barely noticed. Her heart was racing too fast, her palms pressed against the cool marble of the bar as she tried to steady herself. Jackson was in the next room, with Warren, making a deal that could cost him Sauter. Everything. Her fingers curled around the edge of the counter, knuckles white. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had spent her whole life pushing people away, proving she could survive without anyone's help. She had fought for every inch of ground she stood on. And yet, now she was standing here, waiting for Jackson Lancaster to fight for her. The door creaked open behind her, breaking the silence. Genesis turned sharply. Mateo stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. It's done. Her stomach dropped. What do you mean it's done? Mateo exhaled, stepping inside. He signed it. The air la Marseillaise rushed from her lungs. Jackson had actually done it. He had walked into that room and handed his entire empire and womb over to his brother. For her. A sharp ache spread through her chest. Something too big, too raw to push down. She needed to see him. Now. Jackson was already at the bar when she found him.